Hello, I'm Mark Wilson and I'm the exhibition officer at the People's History Museum. I'd just like to welcome everybody to this evening's Radical Late, the origins of Jewish immigration, social history in Manchester and London. Tonight we'll be exploring the maverick curators, grassroots historians who pioneered the collection of objects, stories of everyday life in these Jewish immigrant communities, and how those oral histories collections are being used today. So just a bit of housekeeping and how this evening is going to run. We have 4 speakers who will be presenting to you. Then we will be taking a short break, and then we will be resuming with a question and answer session for any of those presentations and questions that you might have. So just to let you know, during the webinar, all attendees will have their cameras and microphones automatically disabled. And you will be able to see and hear the panelists and hosts. Now, you can leave the webinar at any time with the Leave Meeting button. The webinar won't be locked, so you will be able to rejoin at any point. Now, you're invited to post questions throughout the session on the Q&A function, but we won't be asking those questions till the end after the presentations are finished. So if people can keep their questions as short as concise as possible, that will help us to get through as many questions as we can. So without further ado, I think we will start on our first presentation. And our first speaker is Professor Tony Kushner from the Parkes Institute for the Study of Jewish and Non-Jewish Relations, the History Department of the University of Southampton. So I'll hand over now to Tony.
Thanks very much, Mark. And there'll be a minor technical interlude where we share the screen. Great. Thank you. So, representing and preserving the Jewish immigrant heritage. So this is going to look at both places that Mark outlined in the introduction and slightly beyond. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a mismatch between the reality of the British Jewish experience and the preservation of the heritage which the Jews had created. The story in Manchester was hardly a straightforward journey from Cheetham Hill to Cheadle, or in London from Whitechapel to Golders Green. Nevertheless, from the earliest days of mass immigration from Eastern Europe through to the second half of the 20th century, there was, if uneven and incomplete, social and economic advancement, and the moving at least to working class suburbs and beyond. What is undoubtedly the case is that whilst not all second and third generation East European Jews became professionals, by the last third of the 20th century, the original settlement areas have been largely abandoned, and with a smallish time gap, the religious and secular infrastructure and buildings that went with them. Moreover, perhaps not at all surprisingly, for many, if not all, there was no great desire to be reminded of the poverty and poor conditions they had left. That attitude was neatly summed up by one opponent of the proposal to create what became the Manchester Jewish Museum. And this critique came in the late 1970s. Lucille Levy, in a wonderfully waspish polemic, wrote to the Manchester Jewish Gazette, and I quote, "You ask Mr. Levy or Cohen in Hale or Whitefield or Alwoodley or Scarfcroft, and he will conveniently forget his back-to-back in Hightown, Strangeways, the Leylands or North Street. Not surprisingly then that the masses who have spent the past 7 decades running away from their hard lives without bathrooms without shoes, without the education they later desired for their children. Small wonder they are not waiting with bated breath for Mr. Williams, who I'll explain later, to inspire the community to remember its past, to create a museum to the glory of a past most people want to forget, and to put its hand in its pocket and inflict self-torture like some masochistic maniac. Sorry, but there never was a chance. It'd be wrong to say that the former immigrant districts have been totally abandoned. Institutions, I said, had a longer presence in the residential districts, which were subject to mass slum clearance. Jewish shops persisted, and there were those who returned to them out of the choice they offered, or out of a sense of loss and nostalgia, beautifully evoked in both the first slide images, the paintings of John Allen and the text of Emanuel Litvinov. It remains that it took imagination, persistence and commitment to even suggest that the built heritage of these districts could be preserved as a resource for building both Jewish and non-Jewish identities. The campaigns and vision that provided the foundations for the remarkable memory work we will hear about this evening were not simply down to the exceptional efforts of particular individuals. They were part of teams or a variety of local initiatives, especially from second or third generation British Jews. It remains that without two people from remarkably different backgrounds and born 10 years apart, the much diminished physical heritage of the two largest settlement areas of the era of mass immigration would possibly and remarkably have left no trace whatsoever. As a Mancunian born a mile from that theatre of comedy Main Road, it gives me no pleasure to admit that the old adage that what Manchester does today, the rest of the world follows tomorrow, does not quite work with Jewish heritage preservation. London, in the form of the East End, was perhaps a decade ahead of Manchester. Still, Manchester has the last word as its magnificent Jewish museum, now expanded and restored. Oops, I'm going to have to get my son back because it's not moving. Sorry, we'll get the second slide in a second. Ah, fantastic. There it is. It could be there. Manchester Jewish Museum, as most of us all know, has just reopened. So sorry, Lucille Levy, you got that one wrong. And it isn't, in this case, matched by a similar conservation success story 200 miles south. The London Jewish Museum is oddly situated with regard to Jewish migration patterns in Camden Town, and the Heritage Centre in Spitalfields, 19 Princelet Street, is still work in progress as a museum of migration, some decades on from its founding, an inertia that needs to be brought out into the open as it brings new meaning to the phrase temporarily closed. But to start with the East End and Bill Fishman, when I started as a PhD student at Sheffield University in 1982, my supervisor, the father of migration history in the UK, Colin Holmes, had clear advice when I said I wanted to devote a chapter of my thesis to the East End. He said, go and talk to Bill Fishman. In turn, Bill said the best thing he could do for me was to go on one of his legendary walking tours around Spitalfields. That was easy on a practical level. In my first summer of doctoral research, I was living in the Jewish hostel in Stepney Green, and it meant just a couple of stops down the district line. Proved slightly less easy in terms of chatting to Bill. His tours were an interactive performance, the brilliance of which depended on his knowledge of every nook and cranny of the streets of East London, but also many of the characters who lived there at a time when many of the huge hostels for the homeless, those at risk and dispossessed, were still open, and the artist's colony was simply Gilbert and George. This is now, the women's hostel is now yet more luxury, so-called luxury flats. Bill's walking tour was gloriously and inspirationally slow. In the early 1980s, the Jewish presence in Brick Lane was still noticeable, and not just the ghosts of that presence today. It was already largely Bengali, and the replication of overcrowding in sweatshops meant it took little imagination to picture the Jewish East End of a century earlier. I learned what my friend, the eccentric medievalist Colin Richmond, calls the essential need for the historian to be there, to discover the topography and feeling of spaces and places. I was working on the East End in the Second World War and left Bill Fishman's walking tour none the wiser of that very precise history. But it was one that I would gain through working in the wonderful Bancroft Road Local Studies Library and through talking to Jewish old-timers who hadn't left the area, as well as some that had very much done so. The latter included the former communist MP, Phil Paratin, who I remember in his West Hampstead flat with truly remarkable 60s furniture and as menacing a figure as I suspect he had been at the Battle of Cable Street. More important was that I left with a deep empathy Bill felt for migrants past and present, and those on the margins of society, and how this was the model for narrating history. I was 5 years old when my Polish-born Yiddish-speaking grandfather died. Now his life meant sense to me. Bill Fishman's was not just a romantic version of the past. Class conflict and poverty was something he understood from lived experience, and he celebrated resistance to oppression. In that fight, preserving the built heritage of the East End, Jewish and non-Jewish, was a resource and a necessity to Bill, especially as he saw it being demolished before his eyes. The one on the right was from a walking tour of the Chester Street Synagogue, where I think my students broke every health and safety regulation and climbed into it. It was knocked down very shortly afterwards. Bill inspired others, especially those around the Jewish East End project, including Manchester's very own David Jacobs. Later, Ricky Berman was to return to London from Manchester, where she was, with Ros Livshin, a critical part of the team that was to create the Jewish Museum there. Ricky later founded the Museum of the Jewish East End, which eventually became the heart of the London Jewish Museum. Alan Dean, another mentored by Bill, also returned to his family's East End roots and played a key role in heritage preservation, as did Rachel Lichtenstein, who we'll hear from later. I remember first meeting at one of Alan Dean's East End tours for my students at Southampton. Over the decades, those glasses need some attention, I think. These students and myself have been lucky enough to experience a remarkable sequence of tour leaders from Bill Fishman to David Cesarani, then his successor at Queen Mary College, to Alan Dean, and more recently, David Rosenberg and Nadia Valman. The Jewish Walking Tour as a lived experience, now in digital format, as is its roots, its location, if you like, of the legendary Bill Fishman. It is only one example of heritage preservation amongst many, but Bill Fishman, and I suspect we'll see this image again this evening, and it's here in this picture as well, but Bill was responsible for the listing of the facade of the soup kitchen for the Jewish poor in Broome Street. It is now a quintessential stopping place for any tour of the East End, Jewish or other, now with luxury flats behind it. I remember when it was still functioning as what we would now call a food bank. My students on Friday afternoons, as the remaining Jewish old-timers got their weekly parcels of both goodies and essentials. It brought home the tensions and politics within the pursuit of heritage and the need, at least, to be sensitive to the people whose streets are being explored and the vulnerabilities exposed. The continued success of Jack the Ripper tours points to the absence of such empathy. Bill was one who realised from the start that it was the lives of the victims that should be the focus of attention and not the women-hating murderer. From London in the 1960s, we moved to Manchester a decade later, and the remarkable Manchester Studies team Bill Williams constructed at the then Manchester Polytechnic. Their style and accent was different. The passion of Bill Fishman is recalled when Bill Williams led a walking tour of Cheetham Hill or Strangeways. This was history as protest, including the neglect of the physical Jewish heritage at the very edge of the city centre. In 1979, the same year as Lucille Levy's denouncing letter, Bill Williams admonished that Manchester Jewry has a unique distinction. In over 200 years of history, it has failed to preserve a single physical monument to its past. I remember Bill's disgust when the wasteland that had been Red Bank became so-called luxury flats again, with no mention made of it being at the heart of the poorest part of Manchester Jewry, the area that had been made notorious by Engels' condition of the English working class. Instead, it is now Red Bank M4, an experience in Manchester Premier development. As a historian, I feel comforted by the presence of archives and libraries, but through first Bill Fishman, then Bill Williams, I learnt the importance of buildings and landscape and the necessity of looking. On a tour with Bill Williams, even the empty spaces, perhaps especially the empty spaces, where Jewish and non-Jewish life have been so vibrant, came back to life. I have to confess that my first attempt at emulating Bill, when I was working at the newly opened Manchester Jewish Museum in 1985, was not the most successful. Bill's tours were energetic, and they literally covered a lot of ground. Due to an illness, I was told to cover at short notice for a colleague who was meant to take a class of primary school kids around the Jewish immigrant district. 2 hours later, I returned to the museum, only just before a search party was going to be sent out. It could not be said that I patronised them, and they're still probably psychologically scarred by being so close to Strangeways prison and the threat of being sent there if they misbehaved. Bill's tours, both emotionally and physically, were not for the faint-hearted. Their content was too important not to be taken seriously, and for the necessary time to be given to ordinary people's history. And within that oral history was an essential component. The Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue, built in 1872-3, and now the prize-winning Manchester Jewish Museum, is perhaps one, if not the story of heritage success relating to British Jewry. This is more so because it could easily have suffered the fate of its neighbouring Great Synagogue, just down Cheetham Hill Road, another elite place of worship for the richer members of Victorian Manchester Jewry. I remembered one day walking up Cheetham Hill Road to work on community programme scheme at the museum, designed to keep people like myself off the streets, and the Great Synagogue, despite its listing, being no more. It had been demolished by those who wanted to develop the site in a way that, of course, the Robert Jenricks of this world would see as entrepreneurial genius. And as an aside, and excuse me, I've been teaching all day, the Conservatives have promoted to cabinet level in the past half century some remarkably untalented Jews, but Jenrick is in a class of his own. Another did his inept best to destroy the London Jewish Museum, but I digress, but only to follow the example of the two bills and exposing the abuse of power and wealth, including within British Jewry. Even in the early 1980s, the gaps and absences in the built Jewish heritage were more prominent than what remained. I remember when Bill Williams noted the very last residential property occupied by East European Jews in this part of Manchester was knocked down in the former immigrant quarter. Much still remained, however, but it was hidden. I remember a remarkable day when we went in Bill's car in a museum, towards a museum exhibition on the Jewish synagogues of Manchester. And when you went in Bill's cars, it was a danger of pursuit if there ever was one. And we went around the whole of North Manchester, photographing buildings that had been synagogues and were now warehouses and the like. It took what anthropologist Clifford Geertz calls local knowledge to find these obscure sites, many of them not having started off as synagogues. True to Bill's interesting approach to driving, we finished off in the city centre and photographing Jackson's Row, now to be demolished by the Neville brothers, and perhaps not before time with its dankness that was an unpleasant feature even in the 1980s when I was a member. Thank God at least that it won't be in Manchester United theme park hotel as initially planned by the Neville brothers. I do remember, however, Bill parking in a neighbouring police car park and crashing his way out as we were now blocked in. Fortunately, this was before the days of remote cameras. To pull these thoughts together, it took the ingenuity and vision of the two Bills and a brilliant team of younger generation activists to preserve what we have of the Jewish immigrant heritage in the East End of London and in Manchester. Their work was built on true people's history research, of sensitive interviews, and the cherishing of everyday artifacts, which made up the Manchester Jewish Museum. And it is not just in the major areas of immigrant quarters that such recovery work is possible. I've just completed this for Southampton, a place notable for more for Jewish transmigrancy than settlement. But if you can do it in Southampton, you can do it anywhere. To close, ultimately, the work of the two bills has provided a remarkable foundation, which in turn has enabled exciting and innovative work in the digital sphere that we will shortly hear more about. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That was great, really fascinating. Just before we move on, I just let everybody know, if they wish to enable subtitles, live captioning, if you just click on the live transcript tab at the bottom, you should be able to bring up those subtitles. So next we'll move on to our next speaker, which is Dr. Ross Livshin, a historian of Jewish Manchester. Hi Ross, are you there? Yeah.
Hello. Hello, yes, thank you, Mark. Yeah, just had to remember to switch on the camera and the turn off the mute. So yeah, good evening, everyone. And it's my brief really to speak about Bill Williams and the origins of Jewish immigrant oral history in Manchester and the impact of his work. Bill was born in 1931 to a Catholic family, and he came to work at Manchester Polytechnic as head of history. Manchester Poly is the predecessor of Manchester Metropolitan University. And while he was there, he was commissioned to write a history of the Manchester Jewish community, a community he actually knew nothing about. As a historian, Bill was aware of new trends in history and the emergence of the writing of social history. And from the beginning, his approach was to place the history of the Jewish community into a wider urban, social, economic, and political context. This was very different from the traditional Jewish historians who concentrated on the elite and their institutions and their contribution to society, and who looked for reasons for communal change from within the Jewish community itself. In contrast, Bill highlighted external sources as being a strong influence on reasons for change. Also, whilst documenting the lives of the elite and their institutions, Bill was more interested in their impact on the lives of ordinary people. As an outsider to the Jewish community, he did not feel bound by the need to always present a good image of the community, so often felt by the establishment. Initially, the book was meant to extend into the 20th century. It actually finished in the end in 1875. But at that point, Bill started interviewing members of the community, taking notes by hand. But he then met Paul Thompson at a talk in Manchester and was introduced to the recording of oral history. Paul has been described as the father of British oral history. And Paul advised him on methodology and technology and encouraged the collection of life stories. By 1974, Bill began to use a Ewer recording machine that was a portable reel-to-reel that you could carry around, take to people's homes. And he became a member of the Oral History Society. He later became its secretary for a while. Bill was also introduced to Raphael Samuel, a Marxist historian in London. And he found Raph, as he called him, to be inspirational. Raph validated and encouraged Bill in the direction he was taking. Oral history opened a window onto working class lives and those missing from the documentary sources. and both highlighted and challenged communal myths. Bill would visit Raph in his basement kitchen in Spitalfields, and Raph became a role model to him. In his desire to collect information about working class lives, Bill established and became director of the Manchester Studies Unit at Manchester Polytechnic, which Tony's mentioned. He had the support at the time of the director of the Polytechnic. This was in 1974. The aim was on rescuing materials from which working class history could be constructed, rescuing photos, oral histories, letters, diaries, film, pamphlets, archives, anything. Manchester Studies carried out many rescue projects and oral histories in different areas of Manchester, such as in Hume, Ordsall, Wythenshawe, or amongst previous domestic servants, mill workers, and the International Brigade. The oral history of the Jewish immigrant experience was an important part of this work, as was the collecting and saving of their photographs and archives. I joined the unit in 1976 and worked with Bill, gathering hundreds of interviews with the children of immigrant Jews. Mostly the children of immigrant Jews, the immigrants themselves had more or less died out by that period. These were life story interviews, often with people who just didn't understand why we were interested in them, since they didn't see themselves as important, but they were the very people we wanted to speak to. Responses to weekly articles Bill wrote for the local Jewish Telegraph helped to give us names. I went on to interview refugees and survivors of the Holocaust who'd come to Manchester. Bill also became part of RAF's history workshop movement, and Bill organised a history workshop conference in Manchester in 1976, in which Bill and I gave a paper on the Jewish immigrant experience in Manchester using recordings to illustrate the value of oral history to Jewish history. We spoke about the immigrant choices of work and the myth of the homogeneity of the community. Bill encouraged other groups to adopt oral history as a means of researching their own histories. He visited Northern Ireland to help people get an oral history project off the ground there. He assisted Zoe Jacobs in Birmingham with her Jewish history project. He assisted Sikh groups, Asian groups, Black groups in Manchester. There were just so many. It was at this time that Ricky Berman also came to work at Manchester Studies, and she carried forward the focus on working class lives and the importance of wider context when she moved to London in 1984 to become curator of the London Museum of Jewish Life. The Manchester Studies days were a very exciting time, as archives, documents, and artifacts were discovered alongside the oral histories. However, there was nowhere for the artifacts of working class Jewry to be deposited, and Bill began to look for opportunities to establish a Manchester Jewish Museum, as Tony has sort of spoken a little bit about. He was unable to save the Manchester Great Synagogue, and you saw pictures of it in its ruined state, but formed a heritage committee of which I was part, and we successfully saved the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, which opened as a museum in 1984. It was around this time that the Manchester Studies unit faded away, and its collection formed the backbone of different depositories. The Jewish Oral History collection was deposited in the new Jewish Museum, alongside documents, copies of photographs, and artifacts. The film collection formed the backbone of the Northwest Film Archive at MMU, now at MMU. The photographs of the wider community went into the Manchester's Documentary Photographic Archive in the Central Library, and the non-Jewish oral histories went to Tameside Library. Bill acted as a very hands-on chairman of trustees at the Manchester Jewish Museum, and the exhibitions told the stories of working class lives, with listening posts playing extracts from the interviews. Social history remained an important focus for the museum. I worked with Bill editing extracts for the listening points and on various temporary exhibitions, such as one on the immigrant trades. The museum continued to collect documents and oral histories and I continue to feed interviews into the museum from the different projects I subsequently worked on. These included interviews with Holocaust survivors who belong to the 45 Aid Society, and with refugees and survivors as part of an initiative by the British Library on the living memory of the Jewish community, for which Bill was an advisor and myself the Northwest administrator and coordinator. I have remained very involved in the collection of oral histories and have worked on innumerable projects, mainly within the Jewish community. And I have become a trainer for the British Library and Oral History Society, training all sorts of groups in the Northwest who want to incorporate oral history into their projects. I'm actually doing a training next week online for the Mountain Rescue Service who want to carry out an oral history project amongst their members. The impact of Bill's approach to history continued at Manchester University when he was given a teaching role in the Centre for Jewish Studies. He devised a course, Being Jewish in Manchester, which encouraged students to look at Jewish identity and to use oral history. The Jewish Oral History Collection and its window onto working class lives has subsequently formed the basis for many important articles, theses, and books. My own PhD, for which Bill was a supervisor, on nonconformity in the Manchester Jewish community, the case of political radicalism, 1889 to 1939, drew heavily on the oral history collection and was informed by Bill's approach to history. I felt it was important to place political radicalism in a wider context and to look for outside influences as well as internal ones. The question at the foremost was how far behaviour was the result of the differential collective behaviour of Jews as a religious minority with a specific heritage, or the result of Jews acting in the same way as the rest of mankind. Oral history was one of the tools by which this and other questions could be answered, such as how Jewish allegiance to communism was an ideological conversion or just a convergence of interests with the fight against fascism in the 1930s.
Hi Ross, you muted yourself. If you could just unmute.
When did that happen? Was it just that second?
Just a short time before I spoke. So
okay,
so rewind a little bit and
okay. So other questions that could be answered were how far Jewish allegiance to communism was an ideological conversion, or just a convergence of interests with the fight against fascism in the 1930s, and what effect of allegiance was on Jewish identity. Were they Jewish communists or communist Jews? Although Bill died in 2018, the work he started continues as seen in the Manchester Jewish Museum, which today continues to collect interviews to enhance its exhibitions, and the oral history collection has formed the backbone of the new revamped and extended museum, which opened in July of this year, a picture of which we've just seen. It can also be seen in the newly developed memory map of the Manchester Jewish community, which is about to be launched, which Rachel will talk about, which relies heavily on the early oral histories collected at Manchester Studies and beyond. The memory map relates to the physical landscape of the immigrant Jewish community up to the Second World War and to people's memories of the community. The use of oral history gives a sense of the rich texture of life of the children of immigrant Jews, which is both similar and sometimes different to the non-Jews around them. Different when looking at religious life, with boys attending evening Hebrew classes and families attending synagogue, but similar in their leisure activities, going to the cinema, dancing around the maypole, going on monkey runs, to the chippy, to the ice palace, and in their interactions with the non-Jews around them. It shows the different conditions of life, from families living in straitened circumstances to those who were successfully climbing the economic ladder. So we see people living in what's called the buildings, in tiny apartments, and in the slums of Red Bank, which Tony mentioned, and those living more comfortably in Hightown, further up the hill. But oral history enables us to see a community that was not just divided geographically between the better off and the worse off, but a community where there were social divisions within one street, between the socially aspiring and those who accepted their lot. I have a little extract I could play you on about Morton Street. Let's just see if we can share screen. And I'll just play you this extract. It's two views of Morton Street, which will be played one after the other. I might stop it in the middle. We'll see how it goes.
Well, Morton Street was divided into about three, with Mary Street running across one and Nightingale Street running across another one. So even then we were segregated from the Morton Streets, that we call them the other Morton Streets, and they were in a different world to us. I lived on the first Morton Street, or if you like, it's the third one. Coming from town, it would be the last Morton Street.
Yeah.
But to us it was the first Morton Street.
See, Morton Street was split up into about 3 different parts. Well, one of the parts was where the Reiche lived, you see. Now, all those people that lived in that part were all the comfortable Jews. So they didn't mix with the ones that lived in our part of Morton Street. Never. Never. They had their own little shul at the top.
Okay, just stop the share. Shul being synagogue. So we see how Morton Street, in strange ways, was divided socially, with little mixing between the better off or the socially aspiring and those lower down the social scale. The map, the memory map, also highlights working conditions in the sweatshops and the reasons some turned to unionisation. It also shows the difficulty experienced by those not wanting to work on the Sabbath, and thereby brings into question the assertion that Jewish immigrants went to work for their brethren in order to keep the Sabbath. It shows the desire of the established community to anglicise the children of immigrants through the Jews' School and the Jewish Lads Brigade. But it also shows the independence of Jewish youth in joining the clubs of their choice, such as the Challenge Club, an offshoot of the Young Communist League, or Poalei Zion, a left-wing Zionist group. We see a vibrant community, one that was not homogenous, but one which was varied socially, economically, and politically. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Ros. Just a reminder to everybody, if you do have any particular questions after each presentation, do add them to the question and answer function, and we will return to them during the session at the end. So now we'll move on to our next speaker, and it is Professor Nadia Valman, who is the co-director of the Raphael Samuel History Centre at the Queen Mary University of London.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good evening to everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be invited tonight to share some of my research, but also to pay homage to my own mentor, Tony Kushner, and the historians of Anglo Jewry who stand behind my own work. So I'm the co-director of the Raphael Samuel History Centre, and that organises research seminars, public lectures and events, and it continues the work of Raphael Samuel, who we've heard mentioned twice already, the founder of History Workshop. And for the History Workshop movement in the 1970s and 80s, oral history was a key route to recovering the lived experience of ordinary people, and especially those whose stories were not part of the established historical narrative: women, children, and migrants. I'm just going to share my screen now. And I'm a literary historian, and the work I'm going to speak about tonight is a walking tour app. You can see it here, which draws on the work of the historians that we've been hearing about, and also indeed on the oral history that we've been hearing about that was collected. And the app uses a novel as a kind of walking guide to the Jewish the area of Jewish immigration in the late 19th century Spitalfields in the East End. At the time, this was the most densely populated Jewish immigrant area in the country. And the novel is called Children of the Ghetto. It's by this man, Israel Zangwill, who was a young Jewish journalist, published the novel in 1892. And he'd spent many years in Spitalfields and witnessed the arrival there in the 1880s of tens of thousands of migrants. Now, although Jewish immigration was much commented upon in the press, and indeed the object of increasing hostility in the 1890s, there was almost no public account of the immigrant world from the inside, so to speak. The Jewish East End was regarded as an impenetrable citadel with a separate language, incomprehensible religion, and alien ways of dressing and eating. And Zangwill's novel opened up this world for the first time, but also exposed it as a conflicted, fractured world in the throes of change and uncertainty. The novel takes place in a number of key sites of immigrant life, many of which are still extant in real life, still in Spitalfields today. So the streets and the buildings some of the buildings still exist. So what I did was to create a walking route through them. Now, this is in many ways drawing on the roots of Bill Fishman, but enhancing that with a number of different kinds of sources and texts, as you'll see. So the walker stops at various points along the walk. This is, I have just learned from Tony tonight that this building, this facade, owes its preservation to Bill Fishman, in fact. So at this point, the walker can listen to Zangwill's account of the soup kitchen for the Jewish poor in his novel, can see contemporary illustrations of it and the ways that it was represented and the ways that it comes up in press accounts of the time. They can see in the app, they can also see objects that were used there. And they can hear readings from the novel that talk about placing, and also my commentary on the place itself and on the novel. And one more layer to all of these sources is oral history. So I used a number of oral history recordings that were made by researchers working in the 1980s at what was then the Museum of Jewish Life in East Finchley. And the subjects of those interviews were ordinary people then in their 80s, who had in fact lived in more or less the same world that Zangwill's novels sprang from. So what I wanted to do was to make these different sources speak to each other and to reflect on how different forms of distance in time or space created different and overlapping versions of the past. Now, Zangwill is a compelling guide to Spitalfields, and his own intimate connection to the Jewish East End as a participant and witness has meant that his novel is often taken as documentary. And indeed, there's reasons I can see why, because many aspects of the novel's plot and descriptive detail are quite verifiable. So the story is set in a formerly grand but now dilapidated terrace of houses called Royal Street. And those who know Spitalfields will know that there is a street called Princelet Street. So he's using names that are very close. So anyone familiar with the area would recognize those names. And there are closely observed other local details. For example, in a chapter on labor unrest, Zangwill includes an almost verbatim transcription of the demands that workers were making during the 1889 Jewish tailors' strike. So he was clearly very had close knowledge of the area, and he transcribed it directly into the novel in many ways. Now, Zangwill was also appealing to me because his historiographical perspective accords with mine. And this is the point where I want to go back to the historians of Jewish immigration of the 1970s and 80s. That's the subject of this evening's discussion. So these historians, among them Bill Fishman, Bill Williams, Lara Marks, Ricky Berman, and others that we've heard of, were making a conscious intervention into a tradition of historiography that had been shaped by the usually self-elected leaders of the Anglo-Jewish community. The history of the Jews in 19th century England, according to this view, was one of increasing integration and prosperity, with notable successes like the campaign for Jewish emancipation in the early Victorian period, and that claimed the right of professing Jews to be able to serve in Parliament, although it really affected only a very, very tiny minute elite of Anglo-Jews. And throughout the 20th century, histories of the Jews tended to be the stories of heroes who had achieved advances in equality or other kinds of professional celebrity. Now, immigrant Jews were threaded into this story as the grateful recipients of the philanthropy of the Jewish middle and upper classes. Using the writing and speeches and public self-representation of the notables of the Anglo-Jewish community, these were people who had established schools, youth clubs, soup kitchens, maternity services. Using the writings of those people, the history of Anglo-Jewry became a story of collective self-help, with the objective firstly of Anglicization and secondly of upward mobility. And in the historiography, there was little scrutiny of the motives of these leaders. However, from the 70s and 80s, as we've been hearing, a new generation of historians started to tell this story in a different way, looking primarily at the class interests at work in Anglo-Jewish philanthropy and the fear of anti-Semitism that drove their desire to suppress the foreignness of the immigrants. And at the same time, there was a new emphasis on the lived experience of Jewish immigrants as agents and not just as passive subjects of education and welfare schemes, and indeed of places like the East End as sites of conflict. Now, Israel Zangwill too documents Jewish immigrant life from below. So here, for example, is his account of the school gate scene at the Jews' Free School in Spitalfields, where Zangwill himself was a pupil and later a teacher. And Zangwill's narrator revels in this scene, in the unruly diversity of a crowd of children swarming down the narrow streets towards the Jews' Free School in Bell Lane. And this school, the Jews' Free School, was originally established in the early 19th century as a philanthropic venture to help the children of local Jewish peddlers into more respectable trades. And in Zangwill's time, it had become one of the most powerful instruments of acculturation in immigrant life. So this is how Zangwill represents it. Moses, the character he's talking about in this scene, Moses was only awakened from his daydream by the brazen clanging of a bell. It was the bell of the great ghetto school, summoning its pupils from the reeking courts and alleys, from the garrets and the cellars, calling them to come and be anglicized. And they came in a great straggling procession, recruited from every land and byway, big children and little children, boys in blackening corduroy and girls in washed out cotton, tidy children and ragged children, children in great shapeless boots gaping at the toes, sickly children and sturdy children and diseased children, all hastening at the inexorable clang of the big school bell to be ground in the same great, blind, inexorable governmental machine. So in this description, very typical of Zangwill's kind of very excessive style, you might say. But what he's doing, it's not just like an excess of words. I think it's celebrating the extraordinary diversity of the Jewish immigrant population and also lamenting their subjection to the disciplinarian regime of the school and their reduction to a nondescript conformity. And at the end of that passage, you have a description of a sullen, wild-eyed mite in petticoats being dragged along screaming towards distasteful durance. Now, this may be just a child who doesn't want to go to school, but I think it points to something much bigger. The Jews' Free School did indeed seek nothing less than a total transformation of its pupils. And we can see this in these promotional photographs from the school. This is an image of girls in Standard 0, titled As They Enter School, Raw Material. Children arriving from Romania, Russia, Germany, etc., unable to speak English. And as they leave school, the finished article. So you can see here the difference between the kind of language used on the one hand by the institution, the school, which presents itself as a kind of successful factory that takes in raw material and delivers finished articles. So the difference between that and, on the other hand, the experience of the children that Zangwill records, with his emphasis on their disorderliness and their rebellion. So that little girl he describes at the end of the scene being dragged kicking and screaming into school, she's perhaps the one that voices the frustrations that others more effectively hold back. And what Zangwill doesn't actually spell out here, although it's implicit, is that the school had a strict policy of suppressing the children's mother tongue of Yiddish. But what is clear in his description is his critique of the coercive policy of Anglicization and his attention to the cultural losses entailed in integration and upward mobility. And to add in a further layer, the oral history recordings that I used in the app, so I'm going to play them now. Sorry, 1 minute. And these are two, rather like Roz, I'm going to play two accounts of the experience of these two people who both attended the Jews' Free School in the period just after Zangwill was writing about it.
Nadia, we can't hear it.
Okay, okay, sorry, that the audio wasn't working there. I'm not sure why that is.
I think it might be because you've got your headphones on.
Right, okay. All right, well, I can just, it's a pity you don't hear their voices, but I can tell you what they were saying. And they was, the first woman is describing how pleased she was to please her teacher when she met her on the first day at school, because she was Romanian and she knew some letters from the English alphabet, and the teacher praised her. And you can hear in her voice the pleasure that she had in pleasing her teacher. And in the second clip, the man there talks about having his work written through in red with the words, "This is not English." And he is describing the humiliation of the experience at school of being told that he didn't write English well enough. And he, I think, is much more aware and articulates, and you can also, again, you can hear that in his voice, of the disciplining function of the school. So this collage of voices, images, and texts suggests a range of responses to Anglicization in the Jewish East End. And in my view, one of the historians who best captured the immigrant environment of Spitalfields was Jerry White. And Jerry White, you may know, he later became the author of a magisterial series of books on the history of London. But his first book is this, Rothschild Buildings, published in 1980, and very much inspired by Raphael Samuel and by Bill Fishman. And this book was, unlike the books on London, it's a micro-history of a single tenement building in Spitalfields in the period that Zangwill was writing about in Children of the Ghetto. So White is interested in the specific immigrant milieu, but he's also interested in thinking about that in relation to the forces that eventually led to its demise in the course of the 20th century. And this account is based primarily in oral history. And he's able to show that the institutions of social control like the Jews' Free School or the youth clubs established by Anglo-Jewish philanthropists, those clubs that were intended to keep the children of immigrants off the streets and on the straight and narrow. These were less successful than they claimed. Most young Jews were bored by the improving activities on offer and went in droves to local music halls instead. Nonetheless, White argues, the long-term impact of policies like suppressing the Yiddish language resulted in weakening ties to the immigrant past. And meanwhile, the religious establishment explicitly preached against collective organizing like the nascent socialist groups and union organizing that was happening in Spitalfields in this period. And at the same time also, Jewish welfare organizations that were set up and funded and run by members of the Jewish middle class, they were offering small business loans to people and effectively fostering a kind of ethos of individualism rather than collective solidarity. So I think it's this path of change that Zangwill sees when he observes the children hastening to be ground in the great Jews' Free School child grinder. But I want to end with what I think is another key contribution that White makes to the historiography of the Jewish East End. He's repeatedly attentive to those urban contexts where Jews and non-Jews interact. So he draws attention, for example, to charwomen, to children playing in the street. Among the Rothschild's building's residents, he notes, the games that immigrant children played in the street were the same as their non-Jewish classmates and did not display any distinctive characteristics of immigrant origins. And this interaction too between Jews and non-Jews was a force shaping long-term change. But that is a force and a theme that is totally absent from Israel Zangwill's Spitalfields, which he represents as, in effect, a ghetto, entirely inward-looking and unconcerned with the Gentile world. And in striking contrast, White argues the ghetto walls had gaps in them. So I think this idea of the East End as porous rather than self-contained, as mobile rather than self-sufficient, is a significant legacy from 1980s historiography and a path towards new research. We might call it the challenge of asking, where does the Jewish East End end? Thank you.
Thanks, Nadia. That was great. And on to our final speaker now, Dr. Rachel Lichtenstein, writer and oral historian of Manchester Centre for Public History and Heritage at Manchester Metropolitan.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to start by going back, or maybe following on from where Nadia leaves in the 1980s, to talk about my first meeting with Bill Fishman, which was in 1991. I was working at the time as the unpaid artist in residence at the Prinsett Street Synagogue, which Tony mentioned earlier. And I was down in the basement one day looking after an exhibition of artwork there, and Bill Fishman, who was on the board at the time, had come in to do one of his tours, and he came downstairs to meet me, and from that point onwards became my mentor and my friend. And whenever I had the opportunity, I'd join him on a walk around the area. I'd love to watch him standing on the corner of a Whitechapel street, enthralling a group of students with personal memories of the Battle of Cable Street and anecdotes about the characters and events that made up the mythology of the area. As he wandered down Brick Lane, he'd remember places from childhood, like the site of the Russian steam baths opposite the mosques. I can see them now, he would say, the devout men with their side locks and long beards, freshly scrubbed, with towels round their necks, and the women in heavy skirts and wigs lined up waiting to get into the mikveh. He took me to the sites of the first Yiddish theatre in London, the old Jewish soup kitchen already mentioned, the church hall in Hanbury Street where the anarchists met. He recalled the area filled with workshops with Jewish tailors, pressers and cutters. You could hear the hum of the machinery from early morning till late at night, he said. And in the summer, the women with their headscarves on would sit outside the doorways, keeping out of the indoor heat. And everywhere the old Jewish ghetto dwellers were going off to their evening services. We would stop on the corner of Brick Lane and Old Montague Street, where Bloom's was once located. And another regular stop on any walk with Bill would be the site of the Bricklay Mosque on the corner of Brick Lane and Fournier Street, that was once the Spitalfields' great synagogue. And many times I heard him say, this building exemplifies the whole immigrant experience to the area. Once where the Kol Nidra services intoned on Yom Kippur, you now hear the sound of Muslims praying on Ramadan. We'd stop in Fashion Street, Bill showing me the flat where the eminent post-war playwright Arnold Wesker was born, or reading the description of the street in the opening chapter of Israel Zangwill's Children of the Ghetto. But his favourite stop was the East London Mosque in Filgate Street, which was situated directly next door to one of the last functioning synagogues in Whitechapel. This is a unique phenomenon, he said to me the last time we were there together. To have a Muslim settlement and a Jewish settlement cheek by jowl, the only other place in the world you might find this combination is Jerusalem. Bill was touched by the fact that during Yom Kippur a few years previously, the imam had ordered the builders at the mosque to stop work out of respect for the worshippers of the synagogue. The world should learn from this example, he said. As Tony mentioned earlier, his walks were far more than just historical tours. He was engaged with the contemporary world around him and constantly interacted with people on the street, whether it was interested tourists stopping to catch the tail end of his talk or older Bengali people on their way home from the local shops. Bill spoke fluent Urdu, learnt during his 7 years in the British Army in India, and he never missed an opportunity to use the language. Salam Aleichem, he'd shout whilst waving his walking stick about, before launching into a conversation with a bewildered Bangladeshi elder he stopped on the street. With a twinkle in his eye, he'd say, when I walk these streets, it's like being back in Bombay, and I love speaking Urdu to the older people here. They're so surprised to hear an old white man who can talk their language. Laughing, he said, it's the madness in my soul. I can't help it. Back in the 1930s, when Bill was a child, the area could be a dangerous place as a young man, and he was involved with numerous skirmishes with the black shirt gangs. On the 4th of October 1936, Bill was witness to the legendary Battle of Cable Street. I was at Gardener's Corner at Aldgate, and I watched the Irish and the Jews pour from every corner of East London to unite to stop Mosley and his black shirts marching down Cable Street. Catholic dockers walked side by side with bearded Jews, shouting in unison, "They shall not pass," before building and manning barricades that prevented Mosley's incursion, and culminated in a day-long battle with the police, who tried to clear the way to let the fascists through. Every Friday night as a child, Bill told me about accompanying his grandfather to the local synagogue. And if noise came from the congregation whilst the rabbi was talking, Zayda would bang his hands on the bench and shout, "Shah, Shah," and people would keep quiet. He commanded respect. His grandfather instilled the Jewish principles of compassion and charity. And on many occasions, Bill told me he'd walk with him, and his immediate response when being stopped by someone less fortunate than himself was to press a handful of coins into their hands, with a solemn declaration in the Yiddish vernacular, "Thank you for asking me." These simple acts of kindness summed up for Bill the spirit of the Jewish East End. And every time I had the honor to walk with him, he brought the place alive for me, with stories from his own childhood, myths from before he was born, and tales from his contemporary walks. Without expert guides like Bill Fishman, it is almost impossible to get any sense of a Jewish past in Brick Lane today. His writings and his memories leave a legacy for future generations. He put the Jewish East End on the map. He really was the last of the Mohicans. I'd now like to share a short clip, and Bill and others who've been mentioned earlier, including David Jacobs, who I'll talk about soon, and Alan Dean, really taught me how to become a social and oral historian of the area. And Bill actually became someone that I interviewed many times. So I'm just going to play a short video clip of an interview with him from 2004.
Well, I was born in Philpott Street at home on that marvellous day, the 1st of April, 1921. Pure Cockney, within a mile of St Mary le Bow Bells. Conceived, as I say, in the East End. My formative years, up to the age of 15, was spent in East London. First with amongst a Jewish community, of which my father and mother were members. My grandfather was an immigrant who came from Russia and Poland on my mother's side, was a rabbi. And my father's father, who died very early from a sweatshop disease here, was a tailor, also an immigrant. So both my parents were of immigrant descent. And they were immigrants themselves, in fact, as youngsters.
And did you speak Yiddish at home?
I did, yes. I still speak Yiddish. It was my second language.
It's a very short clip there of the wonderful, inspirational Bill Fishman, who so many people have spoken about. He featured in my first book, Radinsky's Room, and has inspired all the work that I've done since then. But I just want to talk briefly about somebody else who's been a great inspiration and support to Jewish social history, both in Manchester and also in London, and that's David Jacobs. There's a whole wonderful story about how I met David Jacobs in the archive basement in Poland many years ago when I was writing Radinsky's Room. But I want to talk to you now about the grassroots work that people like David Jacobs were conducting in the 1970s in London. And when I was researching this book, I asked David if he knew anything about the Masiki Hadath synagogue on the corner of Brick Lane, which I mentioned earlier. And he told me that he'd taken pictures of the building in the 1970s and had numerous bits of ephemera in his archive from there. David was one of the first people into the building after it closed. There was all sorts of stuff lying around on the floor, so I gathered it up to save it, he said. He described walking into the building on that occasion. It was the first of many synagogues he later explored, and it had a magical effect on me and was the beginning of a long-term passion. The people in the kosher wine shop opposite had told David about the synagogue. Mendel was one of the founding members and used its vaults to store and brew his kosher wines, he said. I entered the synagogue via the side door in Fournier Street. It was open, so I just gave it a little shove and pushed my way into a small vestibule before going into the synagogue itself. It was in very poor condition. The windows broken and leaves and debris covered the floor, and all the ritual objects had obviously been removed, but there were things left around, like various papers and a clock face with Hebrew numbers on it. It was dark, dusty, and quite spooky walking in there for the first time. I felt like an intruder, and I was quite nervous. It was the first time I'd done something like this, but it must have had a big impression on me as I went on to document in a much more formal way many abandoned synagogues in the East End. It was 1972, shortly after it had closed, and it felt if the Jewish community had only just vacated it. And from there, I took the clock face and gave it to Bill Williams in Manchester for his museum there. I'd just like to say thank you to David Jacobs, to Bill Fishman, to all of those, as Nadia said, who've come before us. And I just want to share with you now briefly a memory map of the Jewish East End that was launched last year and includes, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, Rachel. Yes,
you can see it. Fantastic. So, as I said, Bill, David Jacobs, Alan Dean, many others inspired me to become an oral historian alongside being a writer. And last year, I launched in collaboration with various other people at UCL, and this was based on the Survey of London's map of Whitechapel, and it's an interactive memory map that you can kind of click on and hear some of the stories of the Jewish East End. And I just thought I would like to play you some of the clips from the blooms from the Whitechapel High Street. And here you will hear, sorry, I don't know how to, let's close it down, see if it works again. Okay, we're not going to play that one. We're going to go back to the original blooms and hear a little bit of people talking about that building.
Of course, that was, well, on a Sunday, there used to be meetings and all the rest of it. And occasionally, if I earned any money on Friday delivering shoppers' goods to people, I might buy something like a sandwich at Blooms. Blooms was fascinating because to me it seemed extremely big. It was big. And you used to see them cutting the salt beef and stuff that people having sandwiches, and particularly putting the mustard on. I remember that. They had a restaurant, there was a counter for takeaway. In those days, it was a takeaway as well. And they had a restaurant with seats and everything.
For us, the biggest treat was to be taken to Bloomsdale for a salt beef sandwich. That was the treat of our lives. Maybe it's the rain that fills Brick Lane with oh such lovely perfume. Oh no, it isn't the rain, it's salt beef from Bloom. That was our song.
Wonderful. Well, you can explore the memory map of the Jewish East End in your own time, jewisheastendmemorymap.org. And there's many voices that some of you will recognise there, including Alan Dean and the wonderful Bill Williams, and over 30 different people that I've interviewed over the years. And it has been my absolute delight, after doing this research in the Jewish East End of London for so many years, to now be working at Manchester Metropolitan University. And it was just fantastic hearing from Ros the story about how the Manchester History Department developed there with Bill Williams. And thank you for sharing that, Ros. And it's been such a great pleasure working with Ros during the past year to develop another memory map of Jewish Manchester, which includes Ros's incredible collection of oral history recordings, some of which she's spoken about today. So I'd like to also take this opportunity to thank very much the People's History Museum for organising this wonderful event and bringing us all together tonight. And this event is also part of an exhibition of photographs that will be launching next week by Shlomi Ullman, who I had the great pleasure of meeting a couple of years ago in Israel. Shlomi was originally from Manchester. He wasn't a photographer or an oral historian as such. He's a fascinating individual who emigrated to Israel in the 1970s. But before he left, he took a unique record of both the Jewish East End of London and Jewish Manchester, the streets around Cheetham Hill and Strangeways where he grew up. And we had an exhibition of these photographs in London at Sandys Row Synagogue last year. And the People's History Museum are kindly putting on an exhibition, Vanished Streets, of Shlomi Ullman's pictures of Jewish Manchester. So please do go along and see them. Enjoy the memory maps of the Jewish East End and Jewish Manchester. And thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rachel. That's great. We're going to take a short sort of comfort break, and we're going to come back at 8 o'clock when we will do the Q&A session. Yeah, we'll take that break now, and we'll come back at 8 o'clock where we'll do the question and answer session. Hi, just like to welcome everyone back, and really fascinating talks, and we have some questions for the panelists. So without further ado, I will get started. Yeah, please add any questions as we go along, and we'll try and get through as many as possible. So the first one is directed at all the panelists. What are some of the universal messages that can be deciphered from the Jewish way of life in England and that are relevant for the wider non-Jewish society? So that's the first question. Who would like to go first on that, answering that one?
I'm happy to start. I think this is a sort of interesting territory where Jews have often been sort of held up as the ideal group for others to follow, more about sort of disciplining the other groups rather than praising the Jews. And sometimes that's been done within the Jewish world very thoughtlessly. We think of Emanuel Jacobowitz, the former chief rabbi, and a very Thatcherite perspective of all the black community needed to do is sort of pull its bootstraps up like the Jews did and just get on with hard work. So it's not that sort of message. I think in terms, we're focusing on heritage, and I suppose that's something that in the kingdom of the blind, one-eyed man is king, that although the British Jewish experience is not brilliant in terms of heritage preservation, it is a lot better than most migrant groups because there have been exceptional individuals, partly because it's been very organized, and so there's an organizational record. So we've seen the losses, but we've also celebrated the survivals and the memory work that's been done subsequently. So I think as a sort of resource, and you think of almost everyone that spoke today is second, third, possibly fourth generation, that it has been a resource for us and our identities and communicating to a wider constituency. So I think it's, whilst there's a lot of progress being made with other migrant origin groups in terms of preservation, the Jewish case is not a bad one to sort of see, to see the sort of successes and the limitations of that. Now, often, as at the time of mass immigration, it's the last thing that people are worried about is preserving that heritage. But nevertheless, I think it's something that can be taken and developed further, and particularly in a sort of people's history direction.
Can I add to that? I mean, I think this is a really interesting question, and in a way, it's a very Victorian question. Victorians were extremely interested in what the Jews might mean. And I think that's one reason why Israel Zangwill wrote his novel and why it became a bestseller, which it did. So it spoke to a very broad non-Jewish audience about the Jewish immigrant experience, like, such as it was, such as he could do that. And I think that it was a compelling kind of belief at that time, and indeed it's become part of the nostalgia for the Jewish past, that the Jewish community represents a kind of cohesive community, a supportive community, one that somehow seems to recall a past that has been lost. And for Zangwill and his readers, they really felt that they were living in a modern world in which those kinds of connections and cohesiveness had been lost for them. And despite all that, there was a lot of hostility to Jewish immigration, but at the same time, there was also a sort of fascination with Jews as somehow embodying this notion of a past that had been lost. But if you actually look at what he's writing, and indeed, if you look at the evidence of the oral history that we've all referred to, what you see is that that was a myth even at that time, and that in fact, as he was trying so hard to show, this was a fractured community, a community that was very much arguing with itself, that had many uncertainties and many different sort of routes to the future that were not clear. So I think that in a way, I'd like to turn the question around, which is to say that that idea of the Jews representing something and having a message for the broader society is something that has always been associated with Jews, going right back to the moment of Jewish immigration and probably before as well.
Yeah, if I can just follow on from Nadia, I mean, the question does hint at the belief that there is a one Jewish way of life, but oral history shows that in fact there are many, many Jewish ways of life and many different Jews and many different social strata and political opinions and religious varieties, and there isn't just one Jewish way of life. The Jews, have come from so many different countries, from the east, from the west, the Sephardim from the Levant, and the Ashkenazim from Eastern Europe, and from different countries within all of those places, and they have different religious, they follow different religious pathways. From the ultra-Orthodox to the Hasidic, to the modern Orthodox, to the secular, to Reform, liberal. There's so many varieties. There isn't just one way of life. And I think that, really oral history, does highlight this. In every category of life, the community is really no different to any other community in its variety and in its stratification. And I think if that's one big message that oral history brings out, is just, that it isn't a homogenous community, which I said before. It is a very varied community with plenty of messages, but not one universal message. So.
Just to add to that, kind of talking about maybe contemporary work that's being conducted in places like Whitechapel. I'm currently working on a project that looks at the story of the Brady Girls Club, which was the first Jewish purpose-built youth club in the East End of London, which had this kind of amazing long history and this very diverse community of Jewish girls coming from lots and lots of different backgrounds, and then has gone on to become a community centre that's used by local groups, including lots of women and girls from Somalian and Bengali and all sorts of diverse backgrounds who now live in the area, who are kind of like looking to some of the work that's been conducted by Jewish oral historians in the past to see about ways of kind of collecting stories about their own communities. So that's an exciting project that I hope will be happening soon.
Great, thank you. So the next question, again for all speakers, about oral history. To what extent and in what ways have uses of language and ways of telling also provided evidence? Anyone like to start us off on that one?
Okay, I don't mind starting if you want. Yeah, I mean, you know, just listening to people speaking, it really gives over, you know, the emotion, the feeling. You know, you can read the same words on a transcript or just in a book, on a blank sheet, on a sheet of paper. But when you hear the spoken word, it is just so much more powerful. You do, you know, get so much more from the intonation, from the silences, even when someone's, you know, really struggling to find the words to explain something. So you get really drawn into the experience, emotionally, as well as, you know, learning from what they're saying. So I think, you know, the spoken word is just so powerful. I mean, I've got a little extract if you want me to play you something, just to give you a little, you know, hint of that. If I can just share my screen. I don't know whether I'm still able to share my screen. And let me just see, yeah, if it's up here. Okay, so this is just an extract from a woman who went to work in the sweatshops in Manchester before the war, and then also during the war. So I think we pick her up just before the war, talking about her work, her experience of work.
Oh, I think you went from 8:30 till 6:30 or 7. You had to work very, very hard for your money. Had to work very hard for your money. But there was one place, if you broke a needle or anything happened to the machine, you had to pay for it while you were working. You know, if anything broke, nothing to do with you, the manager would make you deduct it from your wages. It was very cruel, that. We used to work so terribly hard. And in this place, you had to be there for 8 o'clock or you would be locked out. And then they would dock your wages for that.
Evidence 2P.
Okay, so I think we'll just...
it was a seasonable trade.
We'll just stop it there.
If it...
Okay, there's plenty, but I can't play them all. So we'll just stop there. But, you know, just hearing her, you know, talking about it. Now, you could read that, you know, that this happened, but it's when you hear them saying it and experiencing it that you really feel it much more and get much more out of it. So the spoken word is very powerful, I think.
Thanks. I'd just like to kind of add to that, because like I mentioned, I've been working with Ros, who's got this amazing collection of oral history recordings from Manchester, and it was very acute, the differences in accent from that very particular, maybe second generation Yiddish East End Cockney Jews like Bill Fishman. Very, very particular accent, which is starting to disappear now, which I'm glad is captured in the memory maps, both of them. But I just wanted to share an amazing story about memory and oral history and language. I was interviewing my own father, who was born in the East End during the Second World War. And he was talking about various sites that he remembered as a young child. And as I was interviewing him, he suddenly had a memory of his mother standing in front of the mirror, singing a song in Yiddish. And my father, who claims to not remember a single word in Yiddish, sung this song in perfect Yiddish. And it was just an amazing moment about what that conducting an oral history can evoke memories in the interviewee as well that are very hidden, of a lost language and a lost time, and that was a very moving moment for me.
And very quickly to add that in those examples that I was giving, just that tiny example of clips, people talking about their experience of schooling in the Jewish preschool, I think that what we could, if we read the transcript, see what the kind of techniques of schooling were from the words that they spoke. But actually, what we get from listening to their words is their feelings about the processes of discipline that they were subjected to. So, and for one child, that is about pleasing the teacher. For another child, that is about the experience of humiliation. And I think the depth of that humiliation is really clear in the way that he speaks. It's not evident in the words themselves.
I'm not sure if this follows or not, but I suppose what is unique about oral history is it is about then and about now, and what we've had from Nadia, Rachel, Roz is that sense of the continuation of memory and impact on contemporary identity. So, in terms of what do we do with oral history, we know some of the mythologies that come out of immigrant testimony. Our late friend David Cesarani wrote a very neat piece about sort of some of the myths of arrival of people, family memories of coming from places, from pogroms when there weren't pogroms, they're arriving in Grimsby and thinking it's New York. No greener would be that naive. These were very organized migrations. Money was at the heart of it all, of route changing, the choices over routes. But it doesn't mean, when you get into discussion with a Jewish audience about that, there's a danger of, well, here we are the historians, we know the truth. And yes, we know that there's certain things are not, inverted commas, true, but in terms of the truth of the individual and the family narratives, it is that connection between the then and the now that makes oral history, and its variations in modern form of video interviews, so rich. But like any historical source, has to be looked at critically. But it doesn't mean that this sort of new turn in looking at oral history, we are dismissing, if you like, the detail. It can be used in both ways.
That's great, thank you. And the next question. I know that you are historians, but is there such a thing today, or has that been lost?
Certainly at the University of Sunderland, it's been lost, and other departments are being shut down rather cruelly at the moment. So I'm sure if the Conservatives have their way, there'll be one department led by Andrew Roberts, and be showing how wonderful slavery was for those who were slaves. So, history as a profession is professionally under attack. But I think when I started at Sheffield, at Southampton in 1986, I was regarded as a slightly strange creature. And for one thing, I was under 60. Now I'm over 60, so I've lost that uniqueness. But it was, I was a social historian, a sort of becoming a cultural historian. Now I'm regarded as the straight character, and Nadia will be more than at home in or Rachel in the history department, even though they're not straight historians or historians at all. But so I think in that sense, it's so much more open now and genuinely interdisciplinary, and the history of chaps has gone away mainly. Though the Conservatives can imagine it hasn't. But it's at the same time that professionally, I think we are at a very critical moment, because we're not producing, we're not working for the city or whatever, or we're not lorry drivers. We'd be better off as lorry drivers, I suppose. Sorry, it's late at night for me.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, Tony. I think what's been so fascinating tonight is hearing the story about the kind of radical start of all of this, really. And when, you know, I know David Jacobs is here in the audience, when David Jacobs was wandering around the East End on his Sundays, going into synagogues and saving material, he might not necessarily thought of himself as a historian. You know, when I was walking around the East End as a young artist with Bill Fishman, collecting interviews, I didn't think of myself as a historian, and it's changed a great deal in the last 20, 30, 40 years, as Tony was just saying, that definition. But I think what's so crucial about the work that we've all been doing and the work that we've been talking about is about capturing those stories of ordinary people's lives, from whatever community they might be. And that actually, I love the way that oral history has opened up as something that, you know, like Ros, I'm sure maybe you can talk about that as somebody who teaches the practice of oral history and the kind of range of people who might be getting involved in that practice now, who might not consider themselves to be academics or historians.
Yeah, I mean, most of the groups that I teach now, you know, through the British Library and Oral History Society, they are community groups. They are heritage groups. They're groups that have, you know, decided that they want to apply for national lottery funding and to, you know, catalogue the experiences of their community or their organisation and do it through oral history, because very little documentary evidence exists, or they've got some documentary evidence and they want to flesh it out with people's memories. I mean, as I say, I'm just about to do the Mountain Rescue Service, give them a training next week. And they started to get interested in doing a project because one of their very elderly members, I think recently died, and no one had interviewed him. No one had found out what it was like to be, you know, in the Mountain Rescue Service, or, you know, rescuing people on hills before the service even began. You know, no one found out from him, how did they do it? What was it like? And they thought, you know, they were just applying now for Heritage Lottery, but they're starting the training before they even get the grant, because they're so keen to catch those memories while they're still there. So many, many groups, you know, have turned to oral history now as a way of, you know, just writing and learning and sharing their own histories, their own stories, their own heritage. So, yeah.
I would add to that, perhaps at a slight tangent. I teach at Queen Mary in the East End of London, and a very large percentage of my students come from immigrant families, first or second generation immigrant families. And one of the assignments, one of their first assignments that they write in the course that I teach is they write an interview with a family member or a member of their friendship circle who's arrived in London. And repeatedly, I hear that these are difficult interviews to do because the subjects don't consider themselves people whose stories are worthy of telling. So I think that it's still the case for many people that they don't see their lives as history, as part of the past that it's important to preserve. So I think that even though we have Who Do You Think You Are, and we have you know, history all over public culture, it remains the case that there are many people who still need convincing that their stories matter and that everybody's stories do matter.
Thanks, Nadia. I just want to ask Mark, actually, the kind of same question. You know, the People's History Museum, I was so excited when I came to Manchester and heard about this amazing place called the People's History Museum, which seems to be very relevant to the discussion that we're having. And I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about maybe some of the work that you're doing, kind of capturing people's histories.
Yeah, well, interestingly, a lot of the projects that we're doing at the moment involve those kind of oral histories, and this year particularly, our community program team were really interested in capturing some of those stories, which they used in different ways, you know, within our kind of galleries, a number of interventions that we did and animations that sort of brought some of those stories to life. And I think as community becomes more central to what the People's History Museum is doing, it is very much about the work that we're doing now is connecting more with those communities and kind of really allowing those communities to tell those stories themselves. Oral history is very important in terms of kind of beginning to shape those kind of narratives that we're looking to kind of look at how we present the histories that we do, kind of, and through the filter of those different communities. So yeah, it's really becoming integral to our work, and numerous projects that we've done, the starting point often is those kind of interviews, which I think are so important.
Thanks so much, Mark. I just wanted to add, I don't know if you know about this history, and I don't know much, and Tony, you might know more, but there's another lovely connection, isn't there, between the People's History Museum and East End history. I mean, Nadia, you might know more about this, about how the archives came originally from the Limehouse Town Hall collection. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so the museum did start in London, actually, and that's where its sort of basis was, you know, and it was very much kind of a group of kind of radical activists who sort of began to collect those materials that no one else was. And yeah, its first sort of home as a museum was Limehouse Town Hall before it moved to Manchester.
It's a lovely connection, isn't it? And when we're talking about social history and oral history, we're also talking about the collecting of objects and archives alongside oral history as well. Anyway, maybe there's more questions.
Yeah, shall we just try and fit a few more questions in? So can the panelists comment on the role of anti-Semitism in Britain as a driver for Jewish Anglicisation, perhaps with particular reference to the Manchester Jewry?
So, I mean, yeah, I think, you know, what came out, you know, when doing my research, both for my master's as well as the PhD, but, you know, just you very much get the feel from the documents, from the evidence, that the fear of anti-Semitism was very, very strong. The fear that the community could be labelled as, you know, not loyal to Britain, not, you know, wanting to be British. Just the fear that even though there was an established Anglicised community, that when the immigrants came in, the established community would just be seen as one of the sort of the immigrant lot. And I think one of the problems with any minority community is that people, if you have one, you know, Jewish criminal or one Jewish communist, then people will tar the whole community with the same brush. That, you know, you can't trust them because they're all the same. You would never say that of a majority community. You'd never say that of, you know, people in Britain. If there's a criminal or if there's a communist, the whole of Britain is the same. But if with a minority community, they're all tarred with the same brush, or there's the fear that they will all be seen as the same. So the establishment was so keen to put over this good image and to make sure that the immigrants were Anglicised. And the best way to do it was through the children. How do you Anglicise the parents when, you know, they're no longer going to be going to school? But you can Anglicise the parents even through the children, because, you know, you can make, you know, conditions if they need to receive relief you have to behave in a certain way to be, to be acceptable for help. So the fear of anti-Semitism, the fear that the whole community would suffer, really fueled that drive for Anglicisation, and the drive that took place in the schools, in the clubs, and also you have also people in the immigrant community quite ready to Anglicise for the same reasons, that they don't want to stand out, they don't want to be seen as different, they want to blend in, they don't want, it's a fear of anti-Semitism that really fueled a lot, both within this established community and also within the immigrant community. The need to be the same, the need to not stand out as different.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think Nadia explained that very well in her talk, talking about the establishment of the Jews Free School. I don't know if you want to say something about that, Nadia.
I mean, I no more than that. It goes back a very long way. It went back to before the great waves of Jewish immigration, to the early 19th century, when even then Jews felt that it was absolutely necessary that the public image of the Jews as a whole be controlled by and be improved by improving the wealth, the sort of outcomes, the career outcomes of poor Jews in the East End of London. So it does go back a long way. I mean, perhaps it's also important to note that you see the same process for the Irish immigrants of the 1840s in British cities, in that the churches were also sort of co-opted into programs essentially of Anglicisation, and that was in a context of extreme anti-Catholicism at the same time. So this isn't, I think, perhaps unique to the Jewish community. It's really an experience of religious difference and an experience of minority difference.
Tony, do you have something to say?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everyone. I think it's very hard to sort of, because of that pressure from outside and within, to know what the immigrant communities wanted themselves, what form of Anglicisation and what terms. We know that there was not particularly much choice. We know that there was sort of coercion and that Anglicisation could be quite brutal, as with the Jews Free Schools, but also for those who even before that stage were deported and moved on, that there are many different strategies. But there are those that resist, and so that Yiddish culture does survive, though not as strongly as, say, in New York. And there are those who, I think although I'm increasingly annoyed by the sort of the love story element of it, the Ridley Road things, there is another Jewish world of semi-criminality and naughtiness that doesn't conform. I'm working on a Jewish triple murderer in the 1730s, and he's not particularly bothered what the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue and its Ashkenazi equivalent are thinking in the 1730s. He's just a very, very naughty boy. So there are different trends within, and those that probably welcomed the Anglicisation more than others, and others who totally resisted it in different ways of non-conformity.
Thank you so much. I think we've pretty much run out of time. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all so much. It's been such an enjoyable evening that just goes back decades and connects Manchester and London in such interesting ways. And thank you so much for the People's History Museum for hosting this fantastic event for everyone who's come along.
Yeah, and I'd just like to second that really, and thank all the panelists for this fascinating event this evening. great discussion as well. I wish we could carry on a little bit longer, but we are out of time. And as Rachel referenced earlier, opening next Wednesday, the 20th of October, is The Vanished Streets, an exhibition of photographs of lost Jewish Manchester from the 1970s. So do come along and see that exhibition in the building and investigate it. So once again, I'd like to thank everybody and thank the audience as well. And we'll say good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.